Hey, this is Ina, in with you in the Fight Back, and I want to talk about Lenin's theory of imperialism. Lenin we know as the great leader of the Bolshevik Revolution, organizer of the Communist Party of Russia, but Lenin was also an economist in many respects, and imperialism is one of his most important works. He wasn't the only or the first Marxist to deal with imperialism. Earlier works include John Hobson of England, who was not a Marxist, but he wrote on imperialism. Rudolf Hilfrich of Austria wrote Finance Capital, I believe in 1912. Rosa Luxemburg wrote on the accumulation of capital, which dealt with imperialism. And around the same time, and almost that Lenin was aware of, was Nikolai Bukharin, who also wrote Imperialism and World Economy. But Lenin's work is the most well-known of the works on imperialism, and it has been very influential. And Lenin wrote this work in 1915-1916 after socialist parties, instead of fighting for revolution, were fighting for their respective capitalist governments in World War I. And it seemed the revolution in Russia was at a low ebb. Well, Lenin is looking at, what happened with capitalism? What happened with the socialist parties? And imperialism is kind of his way of answering it. So what exactly? Well, he starts with the idea that Marx and Engels were looking at more competitive capitalism, with, say, 100 firms in a various sector of industry competing with each other. But Marx and Engels saw that capitalism was, at the same time it was very competitive, there were trends towards centralization and concentration of production. So what happens? Well, towards the end of the 19th century, competitive capitalism was giving way to monopoly capitalism. So instead of, say, 100 firms, you maybe have 3, 5, or even 1 in a particular field of industry. So they're concentrating. And at the same time they're concentrating, there's a huge increase in technical expertise, technical invention, say the assembly line, mass production. More workers are employed. Production is socialized to a higher degree. And at the same time, there's a change in the banks, which instead of just lending out credit, it's not to say they're not still doing that, but they're really kind of becoming greatly involved with industry, and they're almost fusing with industry. And they're really controlling large swaths of the economy, and this is creating, through this fusion of industrial and financial capital, is creating a new financial oligarchy. Still capitalist, still based upon the exploitation of surplus labor, but it is a new form. And these new concentrations of industry have so much capital, so they want to invest it, they want to gain more profits. So where do they go? Well, they do invest in, say, England or France, but they're also investing in, say, the more backward, non-capitalist areas of the world. And I'd say backward in the sense that they haven't developed capitalism to the extent of France or Germany. So they're going to Africa, Asia, Latin America, wherever. Because there, they can not only exploit, they're not only not facing any competition, really, at least right away, but there's a lot of raw materials they can get. There's labor they can employ at very low wages. They can really exploit the workers there. I mean, just look at the Belgian Congo. That place where the Belgians committed genocide there when they were colonizing it. That's not to say other colonial powers were any better. Just overthrow them all. But that aside, they really could invest in these places, and they can really reap super profits. And in these backward areas, capitalism developed at various uneven methods. Some imperialisms would be more advanced, say Germany was more advanced than France, but even various areas of the world were divided differently. You would have outright colonies, say Zimbabwe under Britain, or what was then Rhodesia. You'd have more semi-colonies, which would be various areas of, say, the dominions that Britain had, say Australia or Canada. You would have spheres of influence, say when Britain and Russia kind of divided up Iran between the two, or one of the imperialist powers divided up China. China was never an outright colony of England or Russia, but various portions were siphoned off and various spheres of influence were created. And this as well. And from these super profits, imperialism in the home countries of Britain or the U.S., they would use the super profits, and this is something Lenin analyzes, and buy off a well-paid section of the workforce, of the working class. And it almost give them more than extra crumbs. It would give them a stake in the system. They could be relatively privileged, and they would be kind of reformist. They want more of benefits from the exploitation of the colonies or the semi-colonies, and this would and this is Lenin is seeing the basis for the social democracy revisionism, Bernstein, Kautsky, and all of them. And Lenin is saying in the first world, we would call it now, the revolutionaries were not organizing amongst the labor aristocracy, were organizing among the backward, more exploited sections of the working class. Again, I mean backward in the sense that you just haven't developed advanced political ideas of communism. And that's what. And in the colonized world, Lenin is of course calling for national liberation, because imperialism is a parasite system, is super exploitation of the working class in the colonies, whether in Africa or Asia. So he's calling for national liberation, not so much in imperialism, but the conclusions can definitely be drawn from reading this work. He's calling for national liberation movements. So when Ireland erupts into revolution in 1916, instead of saying, well, you can't have a national revolution in the modern age, I mean, that's backward. We should just go for socialist revolution. Lenin's saying, no, national revolution is progressive. In fact, he's saying we Marxists as well, we distinguish between just and unjust wars. So a war, say, for the imperialist powers, because the world is divided up into various colonies in 1914, various monopolies are still competing. And I'll get back to just and unjust wars in this course of this. The various colonies are divided up, but there's still competition. It's just on a much higher level. Instead of 100 small firms competing for a market, you have, say, 10 firms that are huge, the size of entire countries, and they're backed by various countries: France, Germany, Italy, Russia, England, US, wherever. And these firms, these monopolies, they want various sections of, say they have resources in Tanzania that Germany owned that in 1914. Well, Britain wants that. Well, the Ottoman Empire has various portions of the Middle East. Britain wants that too. So they're going to fight, and it's going to lead to this clash. It's going to redivide the world. And that is what imperialism brings. Because capitalism is still competing, but at a monopoly level, and it's leading to a repartition, a redivision of the world, as it were. So imperialism brings wars, and of course World War II is still an imperialist war, but there's still many contradictions in there. But there's definitely an imperialist war element in that as well. But so Lenin is saying, why would we Marxists consider a war for imperialism, empire, and profit just? Of course it's not. But wars of national liberation, to break the bonds of imperialism, to create free independent states, well, that's a blow at imperialism. That is progressive. And of course he's right. You know, for all the mistakes of various post-colonial societies, breaking with imperialism is not a mistake. And that's one thing. And, of course, he's saying the imperialist state that these social democrats, the labor aristocracy, is looking upon as just, as something we can take a hold of, we can reform. Why do you think, what can we Marxists use an imperialist state that is exploiting colonies for? No, we need to get rid of that to create our own type of state. And this is, of course, developed through the State and the Revolution, where he's restating Marx and Engels on the nature of the state as well. But it can definitely be read into imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. So he's calling for breaking imperialism at its weakest links, not just in the colonies and the semi-colonies, but in the heartlands as well, because the contradictions will get so severe at times, but they can be broken. And imperialism broke during World War I, not just in Ireland in 1916, but arguably more importantly in Russia in 1917, where a whole country was taken out of the imperialist orbit, 1/6 of the planet. And Lenin's Lenin, of course, he among Marxists, he was one of the first in the era of the Second International, was really calling for national liberation. He really saw the force for progressive change that was coming from the colonized world. Rosa Luxemburg, for all her greatness, for all her revolutionary fervor, for her martyrdom, not to be denied, she was rather hostile to nationalism, in the sense she only saw nationalism as a backward mass. She didn't see that a nationalism of, say, Britain, Britannia rules the world, as opposed to, say, a nationalism of Ireland, which is breaking the chains of imperialism. She really didn't differentiate between them. She just saw it as backward, just fight for international socialism. Lenin saying, we're opposed absolutely to imperialist nationalism, but we see the progressive role of nationalism in oppressed nations like Ireland or Egypt or India. And of course, Lenin ultimately wants socialist revolution, but he does see that when imperialism is struck at by national liberation movements, that's progressive. Marxists support that, along with, of course, the revolts of workers in first world countries. That's, of course, progressive. But when the imperialist states are waging wars of repartitioning the world or putting down workers' revolts, is that a just war? No, of course not. Now, in many respects, the theory of imperialism kind of stagnated after Lenin, and various communist parties took it as a dogma. But there have been updates, and some thinkers who I've seen who've updated imperialism or use definitely the method of Lenin of analyzing contradictions of capital in the monopoly stage, looking at finance capital, where it's a lot of the work that can be associated with Monthly Review. Paul Sweezy, Harry Magdoff, in the 40s and through the 60s and 70s, and John Bellamy Foster, who's also with Monthly Review, who's done a lot with imperialism, and David Harvey as well, another contemporary. And so imperialism is very much with us. And Lenin, if you kind of get what I've been saying, you can see that imperialism doesn't necessarily mean you have to have colonies for there to be imperialism. He's looking at imperialism under capitalist conditions. For instance, Rome was definitely an empire. I don't think any of us would deny that here. But Rome was a different imperialism. It was based on more a slave mode of production. Lenin and fellow Marxists were looking at imperialism under monopoly stage conditions with finance capital. And we know imperialism can exist without outright colonies. For instance, neo-colonies, Guatemala under the United Fruit Company of the United States. Guatemala was never colonized by the United States, but basically Guatemala was politically independent, but its economy was controlled by the United States. That's neo-colonialism. And outright colonies, again, would be Ireland under England, a great example. It was not politically independent, and it was economically dependent on England. And we can also see developments of imperialism from, say, Emanuel Wallerstein, world systems analysis, and the dependency theory that came in the 60s and 70s, and largely associated with Latin America. But as you can see, Lenin really kind of set the groundwork, and his work is actually fairly easy to read. The statistics there, and of course, they're from 1916 at the latest, so they're kind of outdated in many cases. But if you get the spirit of Lenin, you can continue his analysis. And by and large, a lot of what he says is still true. We still have finance capital. We still have imperialism, maybe more neo-colonialism, but we still have outright colonies. For instance, the United States colonized Puerto Rico, indigenous people, the Southwest, Black Belt, and Hawaii, just to name a few. There's still outright colonies as well, along in Northern Ireland, Palestinian occupation by Israel. And then there is, of course, imperialist wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, wars for raw materials, resources, and outright hegemony as well. I hope this has been rather informative. You can find in the link below Lenin's Imperialism. I recommend you read it, leave comments. So this is Ina saying, until next time.